essay, I explained in what sense Greeks were distinct from Egyptians. I then tried to answer the question, did racism limit Egyptians' opportunities in the administration of military? I'm now going to give you a brief background of the road that I'm taking you. Note how circumstances change over time and location. Ptolemaic Egypt was 3 centuries of Greek rule in Egypt, from 323 BC to 30 BC. In 332 BC, Alexander the Great liberated Egypt from the Persian overlords who dominated the country for nearly a century. When Alexander was on his deathbed, he was asked who would be the heir to his vast empire. He said, the strongest. Upon his death, his generals fought amongst themselves and carved up the empire into autonomous factions. Ptolemy won Egypt, thus establishing the Ptolemaic dynasty, which was a succession of incest, where sons married mothers, sisters, or even both at the same time. The following are the events leading up to the consequences of Alexander's great conquest. Greece was a conglomeration of independent city-states, identifiable only by common language and religion. In the first half of the 5th century BC, there were 2 Persian invasions of mainland Greece. Athens became the head of an alliance of Greek cities who paid Athens to build a fleet to combat the Persians. The Greeks were victorious. For the sake of security, Athens wanted its allies to continue to pay tribute. Some city-states, also called polis, wanted to leave the alliance and no longer pay. Athens went to extreme measures to keep them from doing so. As a result, the Greek polis who wanted out appealed to Sparta to lead them in a war against the Athenian Empire. This is known as the Peloponnesian War, which took place in the second half of the 5th century BC. The war was extremely destructive. The farms on the countryside were devastated. The war ended with the surrender of Athens and the dissolution of the empire. This gave the unscathed Macedonians in the north the opportunity to conquer mainland Greece. This was the base from where Alexander launched his conquest, which went as far as India. This opened a whole world for Greeks searching for a new life in rich and cultured areas of the world. Alexander wanted to Hellenize his empire. He married a Persian, got 40 of his military elite to do the same, and encouraged the intermarriage between the Greeks and the natives. The aftermath of the Peloponnesian War left little options for mainland Greeks. Many found employment as mercenaries and sold their services to the generals who succeeded Alexander, such as Ptolemy. Other Greeks would move to one of the many Greek polis founded by Alexander. A famous example is Alexandria in Egypt. There were 3 autonomous Greek polis in Egypt. They are organized and function in the traditional Greek way. Citizenship was carefully protected by strict rules that prohibited any illegitimate child from obtaining it. This included offspring of a Greek who intermarried with an Egyptian. Citizenship was reserved for only one polis. It wasn't an open membership to all of them. A citizen had access to the gymnasium, which was the educational and cultural heart of the polis. Furthermore, citizens were the only ones who could participate in the administrative functions of their polis. Moving on. The rest of the country had traditionally been divided into different provinces called nomes, a system that was maintained by the Ptolemies. Each nome had its own administrative hierarchy. Beyond a certain level, the top officials held office in the capital city of Alexandria, where the Ptolemaic kings and queens ruled. But the official administrative language became Greek. There's a Greek court that settled judicial matters and criminal petitions called the kremastiste, but the native Egyptian court, called the laokrite, was used everywhere outside of polis. Because the Greek kremastiste had a habit of encroaching on the jurisdiction of the laokrite, after 188 BC, the court that was used depended on the language that the document was written in. So, the Egyptian language, called Demotic, was not made obsolete and still used by the majority of the population. I'm going to set up the military background, and this is where you find the crux of my argument. At the beginning of the dynasty, the Ptolemies hired Greek mercenaries instead of arming and training Egyptians. The Greek mercenaries came from all over, but they were not citizens of any of the Egyptian polis. They would billet in half of an Egyptian's house, which caused racial tensions. The mercenaries also posed a threat to the throne because they had no loyalty to the crown, and there was a risk of armed upheaval if they didn't get paid. Needless to say, they were a burden on the royal owned vast tracts of royal land and offered the mercenaries to settle a plot of that land in exchange for the military service whenever it was required. Many of these Greeks agreed and rented out the land to Egyptians to work on. The Greeks were now free to move to the cities and find administrative work. I want you to keep in mind that not everyone did this, and I'm giving you an abridged background for the sake of time. For simplicity's sake, I'm going to call any place beyond the confines of the polis the Kora, which you can consider to be the Egyptian countryside or village. Greeks permanently residing in the Kora had no need for citizenship, and many intermarried with the native population. If we give it a couple of generations, we can understand that you no longer have an easily identifiable pure-blood Greek or Egyptian, but rather a hybrid of the two. This assimilation has caused great problems for those arguing for the status quo. Keep in mind two things. First, how can racial discrimination be applied when ethnic distinctions can hardly be made? Second, Greek status in the court is passed down to the native spouses and subsequent generations as far as it can be traced. This creates a plethora of situations and calls for a system to classify these individuals. At this point, I'm going to discuss two sources. The first is an archive from the second century BC about a man named Gibrian. He was a citizen of a Greek polis. He married another Greek citizen from the same polis, and they bore a son who inherited that citizenship. Gibrian was a cavalry officer who divorced his wife and moved to garrison a city that was predominantly populated by Egyptians. There he met his new wife, Apollonia, whose family all had dual Greek and Egyptian names. Apollonia was born in Egypt, but considered herself to be a Greek because her father fought in the army. At this point, I must digress to explain that in the late 3rd century, there was a battle for which Ptolemy IV used the Egyptian soldiers, thus establishing a precedent which allowed for Egyptians to participate in the military. The military units were organized based on polis, or place of ancestral origin. For example, Gibrian was in the Cretan unit, and Apollonia's father was in the Cyrenian unit. Now, if there were not enough soldiers from a certain polis, or if the soldier was an Egyptian, he would be placed in an existing unit, and the Egyptian could claim that to be his ancestral place of origin. Now back to my earlier point, the daughters of Gibrian were not given citizenship. They had both dual Greek and Egyptian names, but they used their Egyptian names on tax records and wrote in Demotic. This is but one type of many examples that shows how assimilated the people in the Kora had become to the point where their ethnicity is hardly distinguishable. The second source I want to discuss is a document dated to the late 3rd century BC, which is a set of regulations for how an individual identified him or herself in a contract. The person must state their name, their father's name, and their ancestral place of origin. This document has been misleading for many who argue that this is strong evidence that the purpose of declaring oneself to be a Greek grants that individual access into a privileged class. However, these same scholars have become stumped when they try to account for dual names and false ancestry. Now that I've superficially set the stage, I'm going to sum up this panel with my opinions. I'll remind you that the main question was, did racism limit Egyptians' opportunities in the administration and military? And that my answer is no. Ptolemaic society was one that provided equal opportunity for all based on merit, rather than a society that propagated racial discrimination. Evidence exists of Egyptians obtaining high military command, high status administrative positions, and as influential advisors in the king's court. The nature of the extreme assimilation has been a major catalyst for Egyptian participation in the Kora's administration, especially in the later part of the dynasty. I admit that there was racial